Okay, good afternoon and welcome back. I hope that you all enjoyed a wonderful lunch. We now have the pleasure of having a keynote speech from Sir Paul Tucker. Where is Paul? Paul is here. Well, it's obvious that Paul doesn't need any introduction, but still, let me say a few words. Paul is currently Research Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Monsabar Rahmani Center for Business and Government. He has authored two authoritative books at the junction of political economy and political theory, and he's also the president of the UK's National Institute for Economic and Social Research, and previously chaired the Transatlantic Systemic Risk Council from 2015 to 2021. But Paul is perhaps best known to those of us in this room building for his contributions to central banking and regulation. Indeed, Paul was at the Bank of England for over 30 years, including most recently as Deputy Governor for Financial Stability from 2009 to 2013. During this time, Paul's contributions to the work of the Basel Committee, the BIS, and global financial stability more generally have been substantial. Paul's involvement with the committee started during the Basel I days and culminated as a member of the group of governors and heads of supervision during the initial Basel III reforms. He was also instrumental in pushing through a range of other reforms following the financial crisis, including those related to resolution. But more importantly, Paul is being a true friend and mainly a true supporter of the Basel Committee. So thank you very much, Paul, for that, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
No one cares about stability until they scream for help. No one cares about stability until they scream for help. Bankers scream for help from central bankers. Supervisors scream for help from central bankers. Central bankers scream for help from finance ministries. Finance ministries scream for help from legislators. The executive and legislative arms of government push and scream for central banks to do more. This is why the BCBS exists. It is why resolution and lender of last resort and supervision and regulation cannot be separated. And it was with great relief that Mark asked his question to me in the last panel. Hello. It is very, very nice to be in this building again. When I was bag carrier for Peter Cook in the mid-1980s, I used to sit occasionally at the back of BCBS meetings. 25 years later, as a board director here, a member of GHOS, and I don't know what else, I used to occasionally sit at the back of BCBS meetings. Partly, of course, to watch what Andy and Vicky were up to, although if you sit in the translators thing, they don't actually know that you're there. But it's also very, very nice to be in this building again. It's not just a professional thing for many people, it's a life-enhancing thing. And I think how that manifests itself varies for each person who comes here a lot. I'm an Englishman. I was born in 1958. I was brought up in the shadow of a war for freedom. At the same time, other nations, many represented here, were struggling for their freedom or navigating a new freedom. One of the great things in my life was to work closely in common cause with Germans, Japanese, and in a different way with Indians, Singaporeans, Malaysians, and people from different parts of Africa. And Basel gave that to me, and I'm grateful. I'm going to summon the spirit of the tower, including from some people that we have lost. But first of all, about the brand. Of course, I'm not sure this is in your book, Charles, but one of the extraordinary things about the Basel Supervisors Committee is that it has Basel in the title. None of the other committees do. And although the governors come here and have their dinner and go to the G10 governors, or now the ECC and the global economy meeting. For most people in finance and commerce, beyond finance, what Basel means is the Basel Supervisors Committee and the other standard setters that have grown up. And it was an entrepreneurial man or woman who put Basel in the title because it binds the central bank governors and therefore central banks to the success of the Basel Committee, and I hope to its failures. Basel is also really interesting and I'm more interested in this these days, to international relations scholars and political scientists, because it's a very curious, not quite unique, but rare feature of the post-Second World War environment. None of the standard setters are treaty organizations. They are not like the IMF or the WTO, or even like the WHO. The standards that it sets are not hard law. They are sometimes described as soft law, but others even dispute that. And as Francois said this morning, that this works is something to do with the spirit of the building and a kind of gentle peer pressure that you will be listened to, but having been listened to, that you will implement. This is an extraordinary thing. The spirit of the tower. So the first four chairs of the Basel Committee were George Blunden, Peter Cook, Herb Müller, who might have been the first, but was chair of the EU body. And so I think George was probably second choice, and Jerry Corrigan. Three of them I knew very well, and Müller I met. And I want to say something about each of them as I look back on the past. I'll mention two of them, 2.5 looking back to the past, and I'll mention two of them in a different way, looking to the future. So other than Charles and Jean-Claude, if he's still around, did anybody in the room even meet George Blunden? No. Yes, of course, David. George Blunden was remarkable. As well as being the first chair of the Basel Supervisors Committee, he was the first chair of what is now the CPMI. He was the man who the governors went to in the mid-1970s when they needed to set up something new. I was very close to him. He randomly would descend from heaven to chair interview panels, and randomly he chaired the interview panel whether I would get into the Bank of England or not. I didn't see him again for years. I had all sorts of opportunities come my way, which years and years later I realized had come from him. The first time I encountered him in the flesh after that interview, which a number of years had passed, he said to me, I think you're my mistake. He was deputy governor, came out of retirement while I was chief of staff to the governor. When he came out of retirement, he said, I think publicly, I am resurrected from the dead. I can do anything now. And he did. He redesigned the Bank of England. He is one of a small handful of architects of the Bank of England that reached fruition in 2011, 2012, before perhaps it took another path. He was wise. He was very tough. He was funny, as I've already illustrated, and Charles captures him well. When Pablo, you said, George Blunden said, maybe this committee won't need to exist for very long, I am absolutely, completely certain that this was one of his jokes, sometimes told to amuse himself and to keep himself going. That he expected it to continue, I think, is testified by the effort he put into ensuring that Peter Cook would succeed him. Because had George stepped down immediately when actually he was given other duties in the Bank of England, it wouldn't have been another Bank of England person. And I'm pretty sure I learned to have agendas from George Blunden. He is the father of the Concordat. But more than that, and here I'm going to read from Charles's book, but changing the order a bit, he had the kind of high-level vision of what these committees could be that I think in some small way, and I hope, rubbed off on me. This is for those of you that have Charles's book, and you should. It is a really great book, a book of this kind. It's on page 53. And Blunden is saying the committee would not be executive nor legislative, but rather advisory on the basis of learning from each other. Actually, that distinction from executive branch and legislative branch is rather more sophisticated than you would get from most central bankers, other than, I must say, the French. Also, as chairman, he would be neutral, not representing the UK. Anybody who has chaired any of these committees, and I chaired the CPMI for a while, and the Resolution Steering Group, and one or two other things, will know the home nation puts pressure on you. There are people in this room who heard the UK Treasury put pressure on me. I suppose maybe why I was sent to Harvard. He provided the Basel Committee with the best early years it could possibly have had. It was a great choice of the governors. Peter Cook will forever be associated with Basel I. And I should perhaps say up front that, as well as being Peter Cook's bag carrier, I was the most junior person on the Bank of England's team of 4 that negotiated Basel I. Typically, to the extent that the histories are told, and they're told well it's told well in Charles's book, it focuses on the negotiations between the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England. And all that is true. It's all true that it came from Volcker and Lee Pemberton and a dinner involving Jerry Corrigan. It is all true that there were bilateral sessions. And then typically the story is we agreed, and then the Japanese are brought in because if we push up our capital ratios, then maybe the Japanese banks will eat everybody's lunch in a period of Japanese commercial supremacy. I was at the weekend negotiations in the building of the Bank of England when one of the vice ministers of finance, Mr. Chino, Tadeo Chino, led the Japanese team. It was quite something. By then, there were 3 US organizations, the OCC and the FDIC, as well as the Fed board and the New York Fed. So there may have been about 10, 15 US people in the room, 4 Bank of England people still. Japanese brought about 25 people and seemed to have 200 on the end of the phone to actually work out numbers overnight. That was quite, oh my God, they're doing analysis. We're just doing something called thinking. Mr. Chino conducted all of the negotiations, speaking in Japanese and listening via translation. Over dinner, he spoke fluent English, including wordplay jokes in English. And it was, I think it was the first time that I'd met a man of that sophistication. I met others of that sophistication later in my career, and I thought, wow, this is quite something. But it also had the effect of reopening some things that the Americans and the British thought they had closed. And there was an extraordinary moment when Bill Taylor, God rest his soul, another great man, tried to extract some concessions from us, I think on general provisions or specific provisions. And 2 of us in our small group, we said to Brian Quinn, of course you must compromise in order to get a deal, but there is a point where these compromises are too much and you should withdraw, that it won't be a deal worth having. I was full of myself having been on secondment to Barings and having negotiated deals, but I think it was right. And Brian Quinn went to see whether Bill Taylor was bullshitting, and he largely was. And the Fed slightly withdrew, and the deal proceeded. Everybody else was very, very fed up. Anything you hear about that, it is completely true. I went with John Beverley to present the package to the European Union, of which, of course, the UK was then still very much a part. I think actually that involved doing the first, what we would today call a PowerPoint presentation in the Bank of England on what I think on Lotus 123. Some may be old enough to remember that. But the big scene was here. And Peter was in a very awkward position, because as some of you know, Peter Cook was not privy to the talks. He did not know they were happening, and yet he was a Bank of England employee and he was chairing the Basel Committee. And I myself, and I'm in my mid-20s at this point, in a kind of slightly delicate position, certainly out of my depth, in that I am told you are on the negotiating team, but you are to continue as Peter's bag carrier, you must serve him loyally on Basel Committee things, and you are not to tell him what is going on. And again, I'm in my mid-20s. You know, those of you that went to ENA, you know about these things, I suspect, before you arrive in a job. I'm thinking, what the hell is this? He, with the exception of a few people in this room, he was the finest chair I ever saw, other than perhaps Jean-Jacques Rey, in the preparations for European Monetary Union. It's hard to believe that anybody else could have reduced the frustration and anger from all parts of the developed world and actually forged compromises that actually led to Basel I, without the US and the UK and Japan feeling that our construct had been over diluted. He went to his grave frustrated that he had been excluded, and I failed on repeated occasions to persuade him that actually that what he was fed up about had been the basis for his greatest achievement, because I don't think he could have done it had he actually been privy to the deal that we were stitching up behind the backs of everybody else. Because let's face it, that is what it was. Basel II was a fiasco. This building has never faced up to some of the lessons from Basel II. The reason I asked a question earlier in one of the earlier panels was to raise this question about what went wrong in the governance. I mean, the quote from Bill McDonough reveals in a way that the extraordinary cast of governors in that period, as strong as there's ever been, had it in them individually and collectively to pierce what was happening. I think that Bill lost control of the Basel Committee into subcommittees. I think my other mentor, Eddie George, was distracted by Bank of England monetary independence and the ferocious campaign from Howard Davis, a good friend of mine, to marginalize the bank and the authority of the bank in supervisory matters, which led to the creation of the proto-GHOS. Those are governance issues, and I hope that the new historians will get to the bottom of the truth in that. But here's the problem with Basel II. It's nothing very complicated. It's nothing even at its very center about internal models, completely stupid though that was. And I think Andrea kind of pointed to this earlier. So the eventual thing that came out of Basel I was that you needed an equity requirement, a Tier 1 requirement of 4% relative to your risk-weighted assets. And then after a few years, this is a complete disaster. It was decided by the Basel Committee that up to half of that could be represented by, I'm going to say, subordinated debt. Well, of course, no sane bank would do anything other than act to effectively reduce the capital requirement to 2%. But also over the same period, that intangibles had somehow got back in to capital so that goodwill and deferred tax assets and various other things were not deducted. And an exercise that the Financial Stability Board encouraged the BCBS to conduct in the 2009-2010 period revealed that about 50% of high-quality capital was represented by intangibles. So now we're down to a 1% requirement. Over the same period, a study showed that the average risk weight on the assets was 50%. Now translate this into a leverage ratio. That means that the implicit leverage cap was 200 times. Nothing much had to go wrong for the financial system to fall over. I mean, one of the mysteries that people still indulge in is how can something as small as the US subprime market have brought down the world? And the answer is because the banking system didn't have any equity, or hardly any equity at all. And some probably had negative equity. And if you're doubting this applied to the big banks, what I've described was true of, say, Citibank. And the US authorities should just quit pretending that Citibank wasn't one of the casualties of the crisis. Basel III had three phases. In its first phase, it is just to repair that. And the driver is as much in the FSB steering committee as it was in the BCBS. It was from the FSB steering committee that you will deduct goodwill, you will deduct deferred tax assets and other intangibles. The FSB steering, I'm not sure how many people know this other than that were there. I mentioned it over dinner last night. There was actually a kind of, it wasn't a subgroup, there was a little cell within the FSB steering group. There were a small handful of meetings, including the following people. Mario Draghi, chair of FSB, Nout Velink, chairman of BCBS, Weber from the Bundesbank, Carney from the Bank of Canada, Hildebrand from Switzerland, two non-governors, or chairs, Dan Tarullo and myself, and Tim Geithner, the US Treasury Secretary, whose idea those meetings were, I think, with Mario, and Svein Andersen, the finest international public servant I've ever met, and without whom none of this would have happened. There was an absolutely fantastic moment when we were stuck at that phase of Basel III. Over there, so there's a gaggle of us outside, and I think Weber was there, and I'm pretty sure Mark Carney was there, and not sure about Mario. And Svein wanders over, about 6 of us. Svein wanders over, we're completely stuck. And Mark says to Svein, if I were you, Svein, I'd go missing and send the G20 your terms. Do you remember that moment? It was as great a tribute as could possibly be paid. The second phase was completely different. The second phase, we did the headline stuff, and we pushed it through, and it's kind of what's in Dodd-Frank, and that's where the leverage ratio came from. Sheila was pushing for it in the Basel Committee. Some of us were pushing for it in the FSB steering group, and Mervyn was pushing for it from within the governors group. The next phase was much more difficult. This was when Stefan was chair, and Sheila Bair, on the program it says Systemic Risk Council, which she established after the crisis, and I was its second chair from 2016 to 2021, and I asked Jean-Claude to join, and to my enormous pleasure and honor, he said yes. And we used to meet with the top committee chairs, and we met with Stefan. And we met with Stefan in Washington, and Stefan came in, and Stefan was a bit bruised. And the reason he was a bit bruised is that some very big central bankers were resisting what Stefan was trying to do, and I am not going to name them. And Stefan kind of alluded to this, and Jean-Claude and Sheila and Nout Velink, who was on the Systemic Risk Council, and I think Adair, if he was there, and certainly myself, we said, no, you are doing the right thing. Just stick with it. And I'm pleased with it. I don't think it made any difference. I think you're a resilient man that would have done it anyway. But if it helped even a tiny bit, since you were resisting really big figures in this building, then I'm glad that we were able to do that. So let me turn a bit to the future. How long have I got left? 10 minutes. Great. Perfect timing so far. Banks fail. They fail in all sorts of different ways, and they failed in the last year. I have 3 points about the future, and this is the most important in this building, I think. In one sense, from the US failures, SVB, and the other regional banks, there are no lessons at the level of ideas or policies. The lesson is the American authorities needed to get on and apply the policies to medium-sized banks, because the medium-sized banks had become highly reliant on wholesale site funding. And if ever any one of them was hit by a run, it seemed likely there would be contagion. Now that sounds like hindsight. But there is a Systemic Risk Council letter, which I signed on our behalf, saying exactly that, addressed to the tops of the Federal Reserve and to the FDIC a year before they decided not to apply some of the core policies to the regional banks. And I'm looking at Hyun because he may be the cavalry. This was a problem not of moral hazard in the banking system, that's taken for granted. It was a problem of moral hazard in the Holmstrom sense within the official sector itself. And if I think back to the 1990s, when so much of our time was spent thinking about the design of regimes for monetary policy and how to make commitments credible, I think the same effort has never gone into thinking about the design of regimes for financial stability. And actually, there is going to be no Kidlem, Prescott, Barrow, Gordon, Rogoff, Walsh papers from academia, because as Hyun certainly knows, the economic technology in that isn't going to get anyone the citations that they need to move up the profession. The moment for that was from the late 1970s to the early 1990s. But the central banks and this building could do something about that. The failure of Credit Suisse and the lessons for those of you that are still involved dwarf anything to be learned from SVB. It is the most extraordinary thing that there isn't more debate about this. I was commissioned by the Swiss Finance Ministry to write a report about lender of last resort regimes in the light of Credit Suisse, which I delivered last autumn and was published a fortnight ago along with the Finance Ministry's own report and some other reports. Having looked at it, I think there are profound lessons for you. One Andrea alluded to earlier, which is what if you've got a kind of bank that is adequately capitalized, but its franchise is broken in the way that Arthur Andersen's franchise was broken after the failure of Enron. And you get a customer run of which an individual, a particular effect is also a kind of banking run of the conventional kind. Well, you don't solve that problem by putting more equity in. But nor are you going to want to put it into bankruptcy. And nor is there another Swiss bank to buy UBS if and when UBS fails, God help us, and everything happens in the end. So something closer to conservatorship can sometimes be needed, where the central bank ends up funding a full-scale run, and there's a kind of controlled runoff of the group, which might have allowed the retail banking business to be floated off. The lender of last resort is going to be involved in resolution, because even if bail-in works as well as Wilson, Irvin, and I maintain, and Sheila was good enough to support this morning, the run might still continue on Monday morning, and you need to be there. And the thing about the lender of last resort is you need to be there to the last drop. It's no good saying, I will only fund the first 40%. You need to be prepared to carry on until the end. Two things follow from that about eligible collateral. One is it makes sense for central banks to have a broad pool of eligible collateral, provided that they understand what they're taking and they're capable of managing it if the counterparty bank defaults. The other thing that follows from it is the banks better have enough of it. And it turns out that there are some banking models that in their very nature may not carry enough assets that any central bank would lend against. Because, for example, the bank has lent to a tycoon to liquefy the wealth in the business they founded. Well, there's wrong way risk there, because the customer defaults only when the underlying business is flaked. Or the asset book may be loans to fund yachts, by which I mean ships, which are owned by vehicles domiciled in an offshore island, and the ship is registered in another obscure place, and the ship is moored in another place. I don't think any central banker on earth would want to collect such assets. In the Bank of England during the crisis, when I was pushing for broader collateral, one of my colleagues asked in front of Mervyn, is there anything that you wouldn't take? And I said, well, for starters, I wouldn't take Morgan Stanley's oil tankers or Goldman Sachs's power stations. And it was both a joke and a serious point. There are limits. What it means for you is that you need to know what they've got. And the way to know what they've got is to adopt some version of the prepositioning policy that Mervyn King and I have been advocating for a short decade. And initially, I think Mervyn too, thought of this as, and when the run comes, you're prepared. You know what it is, you value the collateral, you've decided what the haircut is, et cetera, et cetera. We've set all of that out in various papers, but it's something else as well. And it's something that should appeal to economists familiar with the literature in mechanism design. It is a mechanism for banks to reveal what they have got. So someone comes to you and they say, well, what are you going to preposition with me? This. Well, no, I'm not taking that. Well, how about this? No, not that. Well, how about this? No, not that. And in those circumstances, the business model has to change. They have to term out their debt or raise more equity. And guess what? Bagehot wrote his book, Lombard Street, after the failure of Overend and Gurney. And when Overend and Gurney was failing, the then governor of the Bank of England asked a former governor, I think his deputy governor, and an external banker to go and look at Overend and Gurney's books before they decided not to lend. And it wasn't just a solvency assessment, it was what have you got, and they hadn't got anything that my institution was prepared to take. I am not arguing for Basel IV. I am arguing for something completely different, that over time, and the central banks can lead with this, and actually I think some of them are close to doing so, that you start to work back from failure. Because why do you supervise? To hear in the context of one of these failures that I've mentioned, that the central bank didn't really believe in resolution, is something that should have been public or should have required remedies years and years in advance. All of the failures last year were avoidable, all of them. I have two other things to say, and I can say them very quickly. So how does this bear on the world of colleges and crisis management? There's an extraordinary passage in Charles's book where when the Concordat is being first thought about, Herb Muller writes a paper, a draft, with a matrix in about the responsibilities of host and home regulators, supervisors, towards branches, subsidiaries, etc., etc. Fatally, the matrix gets taken out of the note that goes to the governors. That was a mistake. That matrix needs redrawing, but not for peacetime supervision, but for crisis management with supervision working backwards from that. And the final thing I have to say is, returning to my own interests in this stuff these days, I think the Basel is a remarkable place. And I think the Basel Supervisors Committee is a remarkable committee, very different from the other great international financial organizations. And I devoted a chapter to it in my book, Global Discord. But all those efforts developed under the umbrella of American security, of Washington's security. That when Japan and Germany were challenging America's commercial hegemony in the 1970s and into the 1980s, it was never as serious as people made out. Even those a little cog like me had to run around negotiating all sorts of things with the Japanese, because Germany and Japan depended on the security umbrella, and they had been nursed back into the world after the war by the United States, supported by Paris and London. That world no longer exists. The expansion of all the committees here, from the ECC governors downwards, rightly has China there. But this is a world in which there could be conflict over the next 25, 30, 40 years. And you have the future chairs of all these committees have a much harder job than my generation or the generation before ever had. But I will tell you one thing, certainly for the liberal world, is our world cannot afford another financial crisis. We had 2 misses last year that could have been avoided. We cannot afford to take those risks again, because financial stability, it turns out, is a national security issue. Thank you very much.